You hear that? It's the 1980s calling.
The Merlin telephone system from AT&T. It's an intercom, a conference caller, and has 40 features you can select.
Anderson. Yes, sir.
Introduced in 1983, it's the AT&T Merlin phone system, which was intended to be and was a corporate telephone system for businesses everywhere to use. The system was actually designed at the very beginning of the 1980s, and this was to replace the 182 key system that came before. Unlike the predecessors to it, line switching was done electronically at the control unit, and therefore you didn't need to have a gigantic 25 pair Amphenol connector cable running to your phone with each line wired up to the actual phone on your desk, because the switching isn't done at the phone anymore. It's done right at the control unit. It also uses 4-pair wiring. They did give you special cables to wire up your phones to your Merlin system, but you can just use regular Ethernet cables, and I haven't had any problems doing so. Something that I find rather noteworthy is that the Merlin handsets were actually offered in a number of different color choices. You have the usual black finish that you saw in use in offices and businesses everywhere, but did you know that they were available in a few designer colors? That's right, back in the 1980s you could get your handset in what they were calling cinnabar, burgundy, chocolate brown, white, charcoal gray, and midnight blue. This is the AT&T Merlin 410 breadbox style phone system, or a key system, and these were affectionately referred to as breadboxes because of their uncanny resemblance to an actual breadbox. There was also the AT&T Merlin 206 and the Merlin 820 in this style configuration. Now, with this one being the Merlin model 410, the 4 in the model number is referring to a total of 4 telephone CO line inputs. So you can run 4 outside lines into this unit and switch between them. And the 10 in the model number is referring to the 10 extensions that you can connect to this unit. So you could have a total of 10 different phones throughout your building wired into this key system. And as is almost always the case with these older electronics, these relics from a bygone era, time has not been kind to them, and there's very few of these still left out in the wild in service. And the telltale sign that it's not going to work and you're going to have problems is when that red warning LED actually illuminates. Fortunately, this one is still in working condition, but if there was some kind of an internal wiring fault or something wrong with the circuitry, that red LED would light up, and that would pretty much mean that it's curtains for using this thing as intended. Now, something that really dates this is that little switch right there, right to the right of the model number, that says tone and pulse. When this system was in widespread use, you had 2 choices from the phone company for your telephone service, and that's either touch tone dialing or pulse dialing. So depending on which kind of phone service you had, well, you just had to flip a switch and you'd be ready to go. Now, to the right of the system, you probably noticed these 3 box-like cartridges, and these are cartridges. They are removable, and they actually offer different levels of service and features depending on which particular cartridge you happen to be using. For example, in this slot that's labeled cartridge type 1, this is where the feature package cartridge calls home, and you can see that this particular one that's installed right now is actually feature package 2/V1. This is the upgraded version, and with that you got a couple little bonuses: conference calling, speed dials, I think personalized ringing, and a bunch of other business-oriented features. And what a lot of people probably don't know is you don't need one of these feature package cartridges to operate this system. You can run it just fine with that cartridge removed. Of course, this is going to revert to a very basic method of operation. You're going to lose out on a lot of the business type features that you get with the upgraded cartridges, but if you want to, you certainly can. Below cartridge number 1 is cartridge number 2. This cartridge is responsible for getting you music on hold, background music, and a paging signal output for hookup with a loudspeaker or something similar. And It's funny because actually what I have been using for probably the last 10 years now to run some music, background music, for when you place a call on hold, is an old MP3 player that I got on Amazon probably at least 15 years ago. And I just loaded up a couple MP3 files of Seberg background music, and that thing's been on loop for just as long as I've had this phone system, and I haven't had any problems with it. I just have a 3.5mm to RCA cable running up here, and just have the two cables stripped back and connected up to the screw terminals. And in these holes, if I move the lighting just right, you'll probably see some areas where you can stick a screwdriver in to adjust the volume of your music on hold, your output of that music on hold to a background music system. You could turn that volume up or down. And then there's also the screw terminals for the output of your paging signal to a loudspeaker. And you could turn that paging signal on or off, which will just play a single tone at the beginning just to let you know that that's the beginning of a page. The last and final cartridge, cartridge type 3, is what's used for your rollover lines. And the way in which you're supposed to use this thing is have some analog, regular old POTS phones plugged into line A and line B. And if the power should ever go out, what will happen is there's relays in here that will automatically switch the phones that are connected to these jacks to line A and line B coming in from the phone company. So you won't have to do anything. If you happen to lose power, you just got to remember you're not going to be able to use your Merlin phones. You'll just use the regular old analog phones that are connected right up to these power failure lines. And there's also an extra alert jack, which that was an accessory sold at one point in time or another by AT&T and subsequently Avaya. And it was just an extra alert pager that would make a sound or even a visual indication when a phone call was coming in. Now, depending on what kind of feature package that you have installed, the function of these switches change or bidding outbound phone calls from the respective terminal. And you can see that we have a total of 10 dip switches that are for extensions 10 through 14 and 15 through 19. And if I wanted to prevent outbound calls, all I would have to do is switch any of those switches to no for any kind of a terminal. So let's say you have a phone in the lobby of a hotel or something like that. You don't want people to make outbound toll calls back when that was a thing, long distance. You just flip it to no and you wouldn't have to worry about it. Now, these connections might look very similar, and that's because they're identical to the Ethernet port running into the back of your computer. These are just RJ45 connections, and it does use all 4 pairs of wires in these Cat5, Cat6, and so on and so forth cables. So you don't have to buy any kind of special cables to connect your voice terminals to the Merlin. And where it says telephone company lines, those are just RJ11 connections, like what you would have to plug your phone into the wall from the phone company. And I do have all 4 currently connected. Those are not coming in from the real phone company anymore. We don't have copper POTS phone system, copper POTS phone service in this area anymore. Verizon has since done away with that after many years of stalling. But what I do have these connected to is a number of voice over IP analog telephone adapters, and I have it configured in such a way as to actually roll over the phone calls that come in from line A to line B to line C and finally line D if any of those lines happen to be in use, just like how it would be from the phone company if you had rollover or whatever they were calling it at that time. And you may have noticed that the front panel actually has an embossed label. That's like the ones you see used everywhere in the 90s, giving a date of 10/9 of 91, which I'm suspecting was probably the date in service of when this system was actually installed. And these had a very long run throughout the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. I actually remember quite a few businesses up until around 2008 or 2009 still running around and using Merlin phones. They might not have been using them with this particular breadbox style of Merlin phone system. They're probably using it with something that superseded it, like the Merlin 820D2. And here is one particular voice terminal that you would likely use with a Merlin system. This is the AT&T Merlin BIS-10. There was also the BIS-5 and the BIS-22, and that was all referring to how many buttons were on the thing, and those buttons were usually customizable. The ones on the left were used, as you could see on here, for the different lines that you could switch between, lines 1, 2, 3, and 4. The two bottom ones were used for intercom lines. You had two intercom lines. This phone was actually used with a more modern Merlin system. And you could see, because it actually has a total of 8 lines here, and ringer intercom and voice intercom. Those features didn't exist with the Merlin 206 410 and the regular plain Jane 820. Behind this little number plate where you can indicate the extension number or the phone number or pretty much whatever you want, there's a single screw that needs to be removed, and then you can actually take this piece of plastic out and flip it in the current orientation it's in, and that is to hold the receiver on the hook. If this thing happens to be mounted on the wall, that'll act like a hook to hold it in place. But if you're using this thing on a desk with it mostly horizontal, you don't want to have to worry about picking up your receiver and lifting up the whole phone. So you loosen that screw, take this piece of plastic out and rotate it inward so that this tab is now inside the phone. And another aspect of time not being kind to these things is evident with what was originally a nice, classy looking gray trim piece on the bottom and the top of the phone. They have since turned this kind of rather gross brown color from UV exposure and damage. These also had pretty sizable speakers, and a couple of these phones that I currently have are going to be needing some service with regard to the speakers, because the cones themselves are beginning to dry rot, and you can hear, depending on what you're listening to, if you have it on speaker, if you're playing music, listening to music on hold or something like that, or somebody with a bassy voice, and you'll hear the speakers kind of rattling and that telltale sound of the cones being torn. So I need to figure out a way to replace that somehow. And this is the early style Merlin phones. It actually had what they called membrane buttons, and there's little membrane strips behind the actual buttons that will sense your touch. They don't have the biggest reputation for reliability, which is why they were later replaced with phones that were identical in appearance but had physical buttons next to these little strips where it would be labeled what the button actually did. I haven't had any problems with the membrane phones. One issue with these phones, though, is that the volume selector switch, this is how you adjust the volume of the speaker, not the receiver. The receivers do not have any way to adjust the volume. They operate at a fixed volume. And I remember seeing a number of these receivers that actually had a little knob here, a little jog wheel that you could use to adjust the volume. But by default, these phones did not have any way to adjust the volume of the receivers. However, you can adjust the speaker volume using this slider. It's been my experience that these have a nasty habit of getting very noisy, just like a stereo system's volume controls are in need of some contact cleaner. And you can see how the hook switch operates. You hang up the phone, it closes that very small micro switch there, and then when you pick it up to place a call, it opens it up. And these early phones were made entirely in the USA. Now, because this was a wall-mounted phone and I happened to remove it just for recording this video, I don't have a stand to use it with, so for that I'm actually utilizing a 36mm automotive impact socket. And normally, if you were using this on a desk, there were metal, actual cast stands that were used for use with these things. That would slide into these 3 points on the back of the phone, and later on, of course, they cheapened out and they got rid of the actual metal stands and replaced them with these really flimsy plastic ones that have a nasty habit of breaking. But it's quite nice having the metal stands, because you could walk all over the place with the cord pulling the phone and the phone stays put. It's not like you're walking the dog as you're talking on the phone. There's also 2 inputs on the back of the phone. The first is the line jack, which is where you plug in the connection from the key system, the Merlin system. The one that's labeled other was for use with a number of different accessories that were for sale, such as one that allowed you to use a headset. There was a speakerphone system. Then there was one that would actually connect up to a little adapter box and allow you to utilize a regular old analog phone to make phone calls with your phone terminal. So let's say you had this sitting on your desk and you wanted to have, for whatever reason, another phone tied into this one. You just get that adapter, think it was called a general purpose adapter, and you could hook up a fax machine to this thing, a regular old phone, anything like that. Now this is the highfalutin AT&T Merlin BIS-34 phone. This was for use at the receptionist desk or somebody that was pretty much in charge of the whole system. And the reason for the sticky notes haphazardly stuck all over the phone is because I have a number of people's names programmed in on these little labels that I made up many years ago. And there's 4 fixed feature buttons over here for doing conference calls, dropping a call from a conference call, transferring a call to some other internal extension, and placing the call on hold with hold music if you happen to have it set up. And then down here there's 3 additional fixed feature buttons. First one on the left is your message indicator light, which will illuminate to show if you have a message left for you. This isn't a fancy modern phone system that actually has voicemail. How they wanted you to do it back in the day is if somebody were to call in and try to reach you when you were out of the office but the secretary picked up, what they could always do is from the 34 button phone only, which is this one, press send message and dial your extension, and that would actually signal to your phone line, your extension, that there was a message left for you. And the only thing to do is to call your secretary, find out what that person wanted, and then when you're done, just press the button and it extinguishes. So a very primitive way of having messages left for you. Recall is to simulate the hook flash. So if you wanted to do, let's say, answer a call waiting call like you would with a regular phone, you'd have to tap the switch hook rapidly to switch over to the other incoming call. Well, you didn't have to do that. You had a button that would do the same exact thing. And then the speaker button, which is aptly named and just turns the speaker on. But these early phones did not have any kind of a built-in microphone, so the only way to talk to somebody while it was on speaker was to still hold the receiver up to your mouth. For example, if I press this and put it on speaker, they won't be able to hear me. There's no microphone in the actual base of the phone. Now here's where things begin to get interesting. I've got the BIS-34 receptionist phone over here, and the BIS-10 regular old voice terminal, which is what most people would have at their desk when these systems were seeing widespread use. And over there on the ground I've got the RJ45 Cat5e cable into the jack labeled terminal 15. To the uninitiated, it might sound like the phone is having a meltdown, but this is that test functionality. And if I set that switch to the middle position, we're now in the normal operating mode. And so now let's say you're sitting at your desk and you need to call Beth or Susie. What you'd end up doing is going down here and pressing either of these 2 intercom lines, and then you'd go ahead. You can put it on speaker, but again, you can't talk to them unless you take the actual receiver off the hook and talk into its microphone. Dial 10. You'll hear that beep. It'll start flashing to indicate that you have an incoming intercom call. It'll also flash to indicate who it's coming from, which extension, if you have the extensions programmed in as speed dial buttons on your phone. I could page Susie. You know, pick up if you get a chance, please. I need to speak to you regarding those business proposals. And then she can go ahead, if I don't drop the whole phone and everything go flying down the ground, she could pick up her phone and talk back. When everybody's finished with their conversation, you just hang it up like a regular phone call. Now you're probably wondering what the ringer sounds like during an incoming call. Well, wonder no more. I'm using my cell phone now to call the main line. And you can see that both these phones are now indicating that there's an incoming call by flashing line 1, because that's the line I called. If I were to call line 2, 3, or 4, those lights would light up corresponding with the respective line. Now I have my iPhone over here. You're probably wondering what happens if you put it on hold. Well, if you press hold, the line light blinks slowly to indicate that you have a call on hold. You can also very easily transfer phone calls from one internal extension to another. Again, let's pretend that I'm on a call right now and I'd like to transfer this back to the receptionist to handle the call. I just press transfer and I could dial that extension and the call gets transferred. I can also do an attended transfer, I think is what they call it, where I announce the phone call and give perhaps the person I'm transferring the call to some indication and information about who's on the other line. So I could very easily do transfer, and then you press intercom, and then you dial the extension. You hear the intercom page beep. I can announce it, this is Bob calling from sales, and hang up, and then go ahead, and now I know who's calling. You could also do it the old school way, which is just by putting the call on hold and then placing an internal intercom call to the extension, and then you could have a full-on conversation with whoever is there on the other end. Oh, this is Bob from sales. Do you want to take this call? Yes, sure. Okay, I'll hang up. He's on line 2. And then you just hang up, and then the person can just pick up the other line whenever they feel like it, and they know which one's on hold because it blinks slowly like that. Another feature that I was discussing before that you got with the feature package 2 was allowing you, I think might even be included with feature package 1, is the ability to conference in multiple outside lines. And the way you could do that is you'll just be on, let's say, your first line here, and I'll just do 3, 4, and 1 for now, just so we have something playing in the background.
You can't predict the future unless you've
and it's going to play some ads. And then what I could do is do conference, press line 3, and you probably can't hear it now. Well, you could hear there's 2 different calls going right now. You can conference in a maximum of 3 outside lines. If you try to do it with a 4th, it just won't work. And if you, let's say, want to drop somebody from the conference call, you just press drop, line 3, and now line 2. I got to press drop again, and there we go. We've dropped both people from the conference call. And these phones actually had very decent audio quality. They're not digital. They are totally analog. So there's no kind of compression or anything going on like that behind the scenes. But the quality is really dependent on the microphone in the receiver. This is one of the later receivers, and you can see that the mouthpiece is totally plastic. But the older mouthpiece that this phone happens to have actually has a metal grill over the mouthpiece microphone. And because of that, I've actually found these older handsets that actually have metal grills for the microphone. They have much better audio fidelity than the later receivers that lack that metal guard. Placing calls is very straightforward. You could press any of the lines that you want to place the call on, lines 1 through 4. The phones are by default programmed to just pick the first available line to make your outbound call using. So for this example, line 1 is actually currently in use. So if I were to pick this up, it would automatically choose line 2, but let's say for whatever reason I want to use line 3 or 4, you could just press that, and there you go. In fact, the red LED is what indicates what line will be used for outbound calls. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go through every single feature and programmable option that these phones have available to them, but I will let you take a look at some literature that I happen to have. And I actually have quite the collection of literature for my Merlin phone system, which just happened to be a purchase where I was at the right place at the right time, and somebody was just wanting to get rid of their service literature after phasing out of service their Merlin phone system. This stuff isn't going to get any easier to come by with each passing year. So this over here is a user reference card for the 10 button, 22 and 34 button voice terminals, BIS-10, 22, the 34, and then the 34 Deluxe. And here is some elaboration upon what I was trying to describe earlier about the different stands. So this is the wall mount adapter, which you can see you have to break it into these little pieces of plastic. It was originally molded together, and you break it apart and use the pieces that you need. And then the desk support. This is the plastic desk support, so you have to snap this little flimsy little piece in there, and it always ends up breaking. It's always a nice trip down memory lane when you come across things that somebody thought was important enough to highlight, or dog-eared pages back when these things were used. So somebody made sure to highlight the AT&T National Sales Parts Center's toll-free number, to order label sheets, cover plates, the desk or wall stand adapters, the display unit. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think I actually have one of those label sheets that they used to sell, and it's designed such that it's actually reusable almost if you were to use some kind of an erasable magic marker. But you just fill it out here in your handwriting what each button does and slip this into the phone. And here is some cheat sheets with regard to the symbols, how to answer and place calls. I have a lot of this kind of how to make conference calls, transfer. So this would be a nice little thing to give somebody that was unfamiliar with how to use their system. Reading the manual comes to the rescue. I actually just realized that there's a feature that I totally forgot to demonstrate, and that is Intercom auto dial, the signaling feature. And that's if you want to signal somebody without having to call them, almost like a doorbell. You would just press whichever extension is programmed in as a button. In my case, I'm just going to press mine, which will go to this one. And it will actually beep that phone for as long as you press the button. And then this pamphlet goes on to discuss programming custom features like auto answer intercom, do not disturb, privacy, loudspeaker paging. And the way you would do that is get the phone, which right now is currently disconnected, and you would switch this to programming by flicking this little switch to the P. And then what you would do is press whichever button you want to program. So let's just say hypothetically I want to program this button right here to trigger loudspeaker paging. So what I would do is find it over here, star 66, so we're in programming mode hypothetically. I would press this button, I dial star 66, press the button again, and now that is programmed in. This button will do loudspeaker paging. You could also program the buttons for outside auto dial or speed dial, last number redial, or intercom auto dial, which is just like speed dial but for intercom phone calls. You could also do fancy things like immediate, delayed, or turning off ringing entirely. And the rest of this pile over here isn't too terribly interesting. This is actually was curated by myself when I first got the system, and I didn't have any of this actual literature. I went online and went digging through Google and just started printing out whatever I could find before the information started disappearing. But it's a hodgepodge of different information that may or may not pertain to my particular system. Like there's a training manual. Then I've got this with feature package 2 administration manual, a user's guide. I've got feature package 1, which I don't even have. Then that user's card that looks like a newer version. A standard features user guide. So I just went ham and printed out all this stuff just to keep a physical copy laying around. A feature that I have not been able to find referenced anywhere in the manuals and information that I have actually read pertaining to the Merlin 410 is being able to customize the ringtone when an incoming call comes in. No indication, no elaboration as to this feature and how to utilize it, but I remember watching a YouTube video many years ago of somebody doing it, and that's how I discovered it. So I'll put this into the programming mode by flicking that switch down, and if you press the speaker button, there's a number of different ringtones that you can choose, and unfortunately the samples that they play for you don't give you a very good clue of what they're actually going to sound like. You actually have to receive an incoming call to hear how it'll sound properly. If you wanted to use regular old analog phones connected up to any of the voice terminal jacks on the Merlin, you would have to buy something like this. This is a basic telephone and modem interface. There's actually 2 jacks, one of which connects to any of the 10 line jacks on the Merlin, and then the other one is just a regular RJ11 jack that will plug into a basic POTS phone. And unfortunately this thing is actually broken. There's 2 phones that are tied into the same extension and are eventually run into this thing. And this thing just gave up the ghost about 5 or 6 months ago. If you pick up the phones that are connected to this, you don't hear anything. Just a very faint electric hum, But that's it. So this thing unfortunately is EOL, and it's really rather unfortunate because I have taken a look at the internals. A lot of engineering went into this thing just to make it possible to use a regular rotary or touch-tone phone with the control unit. I don't see any blown capacitors. Nothing looks like it blew up in here. But obviously something just decided to call it quits after 30 plus years. Looking at how this thing was designed, it does seem like some thought was given to the possibility of being able to service it. Because you just pry this cover off, and then you remove these little plastic pieces, and you can take the whole board out. I mean, there's only one single plastic screw holding the whole kit and caboodle together. And that's just about going to do it for this retrospective review trip down memory lane about the AT&T Merlin 206, 410, and 820 business phone systems. Of course, this video only discussed the Merlin 410, but the 206 and 820 are virtually identical in features. The only distinguishing factors that sets them apart from the 410 is the number of extensions and phone lines that you could run into them. There was a time for the better part of 3 decades where just about everywhere you would go, you would find these phones sitting on a desk, a podium, a table. Not so much anymore. They've just about gone the way of the dodo in favor of businesses switching to voice over IP and all the fun stuff that comes along with it. And these systems are not getting any newer. Those that are still out there in the wild in operation are getting older and closer to retirement with each passing day. And all the repair people that used to work on these things and keep them in service, they've since retired. So if your system happens to break down, that's it. That's the end of the line. There's no way to repair them. Nobody services them, and getting parts is virtually impossible. Fortunately, my system is still in working condition. If the last 3 decades are anything to go off of, I think this system will be perfectly reliable for many, many years to come. It gets almost daily use and hasn't had one hiccup so far.
The uncompromising clarity and reliability of AT&T products and services take you right there and keep you this close.